a whisper from the past, a locked room untouched by time, and a pale face glimpsed where none should be. In the heart of a crumbling estate, something long buried begins to stir, not with violence, but with silence too perfect to be natural. Secrets, once sealed behind stone and shame, are ready to speak. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's begin the story. It is with a curious chill, not of the body but of the spirit, that I now set down the particulars of a case which, though seldom spoken of in the public record, left upon both Holmes and myself an impression singularly difficult to erase. Time, that great and impartial eraser of detail, has done little to dim the shadows which gathered over Grimston Hall, nor the memory of the pale girl at the heart of it all. I recall it first on an evening not unlike the one in which the mystery itself began. The fog low and sullen upon Baker Street, the fire sputtering in our hearth as Holmes sat motionless, pipe between his fingers, lost in a reverie that would have seemed idle had I not known better. I had just returned from a visit to one of my former patients, and was remarking on the unseasonable dampness, when Holmes, without turning his head, murmured, "Watson, do you believe the dead can walk?" The question startled me, not for its novelty, but for the particular quietness with which it was posed. Before I could answer, there came a knock at the door, urgent, not violent, but with that peculiar rhythm which betrays an unsettled hand. Mrs. Hudson, looking more than a little anxious, showed in a visitor whose face bore the unmistakable imprint of sleepless nights and private torment. Thus began the affair of the girl in the locked room, a case that chilled even Sherlock Holmes's imperturbable composure. The gentleman who entered was of distinguished bearing despite the dishevelment of his appearance. His silver hair lay in disorder upon his temples, and his dark eyes, sunken though they were, betrayed both intelligence and fatigue. He held a black felt hat in one gloved hand, the other trembling faintly at his side. Holmes, ever a connoisseur of human expression, gestured toward the armchair with his customary courtesy. "You have travelled from Sussex, I believe, and with some urgency," Holmes said before the man could speak. "Good heavens, how?" the visitor began, then gathered himself. "Yes, Sussex, Grimston Hall. My name is Sir Reginald Marchwood." Holmes nodded, folding his long fingers before him. "I am acquainted with the Marchwood estate. You are its present master." Sir Reginald inclined his head. "It is not in pride that I say so, Mr. Holmes, but in weariness. The house has not known peace for some time." I observed the man's gaze flicker toward the fireplace, as though some part of him hoped to warm itself not by heat, but by normalcy. "There is something wrong at Grimston," he continued, "something that cannot be explained. My niece, Eliza Marchwood, was laid to rest 3 weeks past, and yet I have seen her, in her window, night after night. The room remains locked. No one enters. But I swear to you, I have seen her face." The silence that followed was profound. Even Holmes, whose mind leapt where others crawled, narrowed his eyes in uncharacteristic stillness. Sir Reginald's declaration, startling though it was, did not provoke from Holmes the kind of startled outburst that one might expect from a more ordinary man. Rather, it was as if he had heard the final note in a musical phrase he had already begun to suspect. "You say the room remains sealed?" Holmes asked quietly. "Yes, my niece's bedroom. We locked it after her death. There was no reason for anyone to disturb it. The key has remained in my possession." "And yet," Holmes prompted, "you have seen her, alive." "In the upper left window of the west wing," Sir Reginald replied, his voice now no more than a rasp. "At dusk, just before the last light dies. Her face, drawn, pale, but unmistakably hers. I do not believe in phantoms, Mr. Holmes, but I know what I saw. Others have seen her? I asked. He nodded slowly. My housekeeper refuses to enter that corridor after sunset. The gardener won't walk past the yew hedge. The villagers are already calling it a haunting. I could not suppress a shiver, though the room was warm. Holmes leaned forward, his fingertips pressed together. Tell me, Sir Reginald, did your niece die suddenly, and was her body viewed by anyone outside the household? The baronet hesitated, and I saw Holmes's eyes sharpen. It was a private affair, he said. There was grief, but also shame. She had taken her own life. Holmes gave no outward sign of judgment. I see, he murmured. And the cause? A broken engagement. The young man disappeared. She left no note, just silence. And now this. The silence that lingered after Sir Reginald's final words was unlike the ordinary lulls of conversation. It was heavy, atmospheric, as though the very walls of Baker Street had become complicit in the secret we were being asked to investigate. Holmes, rising slowly, turned to the fire and stared into it. There is a peculiar resonance, he said, between what is seen and what is believed. A girl dies, she is buried, and yet her image appears, bound within her own chamber, as though the grave had rejected her. You believe this to be a delusion, then? I asked. I believe, said Holmes, that every ghost is born of either guilt, greed, or grief, sometimes all three. Sir Reginald remained seated, his expression hollow. Eliza's mother died in that very room, he said quietly, and there were whispers even then that the Marchwood women carry something in their blood. Madness, perhaps. I dismissed it as superstition. Holmes turned sharply. Superstition is often a veil drawn across inconvenient truths. Tell me, Sir Reginald, was there a will? The old man blinked. A will? Yes, but nothing out of the ordinary. Eliza's inheritance was modest. The estate is entailed. Holmes nodded, almost to himself, and sat once more. Very well. Then we must see this house that guards the dead so poorly. There are few things in this world that stir Holmes to enthusiasm, an intricate cipher, a challenge to logic, or the scent of deception buried beneath layers of social courtesy. Sir Reginald's account, it seemed, possessed all three. You say the door remains locked, and the key has not left your possession? Holmes asked once more, his tone now brisk, almost clinical. I keep it in a drawer by my bed, Sir Reginald confirmed. No one else has touched it. And the windows bolted? Yes, from the inside. Holmes's eyes gleamed. A locked room illusion, with a spectral occupant. Fascinating. He rose and paced briefly before stopping by the mantel. Watson, you will accompany me. I have no desire to banish ghosts, but I am keen to discover who among the living would have us believe in one. Sir Reginald exhaled visibly, as though the burden he carried had grown lighter by merely placing it in Holmes's hands. I ask only for discretion, Mr. Holmes. The Marchwood name will not pass my lips beyond necessity, Holmes said, already reaching for his notebook. But it may yet speak volumes to the facts. We leave at dawn. The following morning, the mist hung low over the rooftops of London, and the clatter of wheels upon cobblestone echoed faintly in the morning stillness as we took our places in the hired carriage bound for Sussex. Holmes was in one of his more silent moods, his gaze distant, lips pressed in a firm line that I knew well. It meant his mind was sifting through possibilities with mechanical precision. I occupied myself by reviewing Sir Reginald's sparse notes, dates, times, recollections of Eliza's final days, all of which seemed oddly devoid of detail. It was, I remarked inwardly, a family history curiously edited. At last, Holmes broke the silence. You observed, Watson, that the man feared disgrace more than loss. Yes. He spoke more of the family name than of the girl herself. Precisely, Holmes said. That tells us where to look, and more importantly, what to doubt. We arrived at Grimsden Hall as the sun began its descent behind thickening clouds. From the road, the manor emerged slowly, half hidden in the rising fog, its crooked gables and moss-darkened stone, giving it the appearance not of a home, but of a mausoleum. The locked room awaited, and so too did its ghost. Grimsden Hall emerged from the fog like a half-remembered spectre, its ivy-clad facade barely distinguishable from the mists that wound themselves about its crooked gables. The long gravel drive, flanked by leafless ash trees, crunched beneath the wheels of our carriage, which seemed hesitant to trespass on ground so thick with silence. Holmes was characteristically composed, though I noted the flick of his grey eyes from the path to the hedgerows, and then upward toward the unlit windows of the west wing. The house has not been open to visitors since the funeral, Sir Reginald murmured as we disembarked. I fear you may find it inhospitable. Holmes inclined his head. It is the inhospitable places that often speak the clearest, Sir Reginald. We were received by a gaunt butler whose complexion bore the yellowish hue of long indoor service. He guided us in silence through dim corridors, lined with portraits whose painted eyes seemed to track our movement. The air was close, old dust and damask, sealed behind drawn curtains and long disuse. In the drawing room, Holmes accepted tea but left it untouched. His eyes had already begun their work, darting over fireplace ashes, curtain cords, and the iron door latches that had not been disturbed in weeks. He stood suddenly and turned to our host. I should like to see the room, he said. The one you say has remained locked. Sir Reginald hesitated. At once, but I warn you, it is unchanged since the day Eliza was lost to us. Unchanged, Holmes repeated softly. That is precisely what I hope to prove, or disprove. And with that, we followed him through the creaking hall toward the upper wing, where a room stood not only closed, but sealed by dread. The door to Eliza Marchwood's chamber stood at the end of a narrow corridor, recessed slightly into the stone wall, as if the house itself wished to hide it. Sir Reginald produced a tarnished brass key from his waistcoat and, after a moment's hesitation, turned it in the lock with a decisive click. The sound, though faint, seemed almost thunderous in the hush that enveloped us. The room within was modest in size, but tastefully appointed. An iron bedstead beneath the window, a small writing desk, a faded chaise lounge, and a dressing table with an oval mirror clouded slightly with age. Nothing appeared disturbed. Even the coverlet upon the bed lay smooth, the lace-edged pillow untouched. Everything was left as it was, Sir Reginald whispered. No one has entered since the day after her death. Holmes moved into the room with an economy of motion I had come to associate with his most focused inquiries. He examined the bolt on the window, the hinges on the door, the floorboards near the hearth. He paused at the wardrobe, opened it, and found it empty, save for a lavender sachet and a single black ribbon. Curious, he murmured, his voice barely audible. I, too, felt the odd stillness of the place. It was not merely untouched, it was suspended, as though time itself had recoiled from interfering. My gaze moved involuntarily to the window. The thick glass showed nothing but the rising mist beyond. Nothing here suggests violence, I said quietly. No, Holmes replied, but something suggests presence. He turned then, his finger brushing the surface of the dressing table where the dust had settled evenly, save for a single faint smudge, as though a fingertip had traced its path through the veil of silence. Holmes bent over the smudged surface of the dressing table, the faint line drawn across the dust glinting in the grey light filtering through the window. He did not speak for a full minute, merely examined the smudge from several angles before pulling from his coat pocket a small magnifying lens. "This," he murmured, "was not done weeks ago." Sir Reginald, hovering at the threshold, cleared his throat nervously. "The servants have orders not to clean here." "They have obeyed," Holmes replied absently. "Yet this mark is recent. See how the dust has resettled at its edges, unevenly. It was disturbed, I should say, no more than 4 days past." The bedclothes were likewise undisturbed, but Holmes pressed his hand upon the coverlet, then lifted it to reveal the faintest impression, an oval, narrow indent, where someone might have sat. The foot of the bed bore a second, even fainter depression. 2 points of pressure, one prolonged, the other brief. He moved then to the window, examining the latch with quick, practiced fingers. The bolt was stiff, but not immovable. "Watson," he said, "observe the oxidation pattern on this bolt. Do you see the line of clean metal?" I leaned forward. "It's been opened." "Indeed. Not often, but recently. And not from outside." He pointed to the inside of the catch. "Someone in this room opened the window, someone who had reason not to disturb the rest." I looked about, unsettled. "But you said the door was locked from the outside." "It was," Holmes replied. "But this house, Watson, has more than one way in, and some of them, I suspect, are not known even to its current master." We found Mrs. Rudge in the servants' quarters, seated near a small stove where she was peeling potatoes with a methodical air that betrayed more tension than calm. She was a woman of indeterminate age, her face lined not by years, but by worry, and her eyes flickered to Holmes and myself with the wary caution of one accustomed to bearing secrets. "You've seen the girl's room, then?" she said, before we'd even introduced ourselves. Holmes inclined his head. "Indeed, and I understand you were the one who prepared it after her passing." She nodded without looking up. No one else would. The other maids refused, said they heard her crying. But I don't put stock in that. Holmes stepped closer. "Do you?" She hesitated, then set the knife down. "I've worked in this house for 30 years, sir. I've seen things kept behind doors that ought to have been opened, and things opened that ought to have stayed locked. Did you ever see Miss Marchwood after her death?" I asked gently. Her jaw tightened. "I saw a shadow pass behind her curtain 3 nights ago. That's all." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "And you said nothing?" "No one listens to an old woman, Mr. Holmes. Least of all when she says the dead don't stay put." With that, she picked up her knife once more. Holmes said nothing further, but I knew from the sudden intensity of his expression that her words had offered him something of considerable value, though what that was, I could not yet divine. We encountered Mr. Hugh Altham shortly after our interview with Mrs. Rudge as we passed through the south corridor. He was descending the staircase with a volume of poetry in one hand and a pipe, unlit, in the other. A tall, lean man, of perhaps 35, he bore the air of one both courteous and evasive, a curious combination that Holmes did not fail to note. "You must be Mr. Holmes," he said with a thin smile, "and Dr. Watson. I feared Grimsden would no longer tempt visitors. I have found that the less welcoming the house, the more intriguing the questions it conceals," Holmes replied lightly. Altham laughed, though the sound did not reach his eyes. "You're here about Eliza, I suppose?" "Among other matters," Holmes said. "You were acquainted with Miss Marchwood?" "I was. We were companions of a kind. She was often confined to the estate, and I reside nearby. I read to her mostly." "And what of her engagement?" Holmes asked. For a fleeting second, Altham's composure cracked. "A young man. Name never spoken aloud. She ended it before her passing, or so I was told." "You believe she took her own life?" "I believe she suffered greatly," he said, and this time his voice held a note of genuine emotion. Whether by her own hand or another's neglect, I cannot say. Holmes inclined his head. Your candour is appreciated, Mr. Altham. I dare say we may speak again before long. As we turned away, I noted the way Holmes's expression had cooled. Well? I asked under my breath. He lied, Holmes replied calmly. Dr. Percival Mallory arrived later that afternoon, summoned discreetly by Sir Reginald at Holmes's request. He was a man of modest stature with thinning hair and pince-nez spectacles, and he affected the brisk manner of one long accustomed to deflecting inquiry with clinical precision. Holmes wasted no time. You certified Miss Marchwood's death personally. I did, said Mallory, straightening his cuffs. As the family physician. And the cause? Self-administered poison. Laudanum, most likely. There was a bottle found beside her bed. Was a post-mortem conducted? Mallory hesitated. Number. The family requested privacy. Sir Reginald wished to avoid public scrutiny. And did you see the body? Holmes pressed. I did, the man said, though a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. For how long? A matter of minutes. She was peaceful, pale. There was no doubt. Holmes leaned back. You recorded time of death as the evening of September 22nd. Yes. Forgive me, Doctor, Holmes said smoothly, but I've found some inconsistencies regarding her physical condition at the time of burial. No signs of decomposition, even 48 hours after death. Mallory bristled. I have answered your questions, Mr. Holmes. Indeed you have, Holmes replied mildly, and quite efficiently. I do hope your financial matters have improved since then. Mallory's eyes narrowed. What are you implying? Only that no one certifies death more readily than the man who fears the cost of truth, Holmes said quietly. Mallory turned on his heel and left the room. Another liar, Holmes murmured, but his lies were rehearsed. That evening, Holmes suggested we take a walk near the rear gardens, where a path led through a grove of yew and oak trees toward the old stables. There we came upon the gardener, a stooped man with hands like bark and a face lined by more than just years. Evening, sirs, he said, doffing his cap. Holmes greeted him with the ease he reserved for working men. You've kept these grounds long? 42 years. Then you know the land well. Ever walk past the West Wing Gardens at dusk? The man glanced sideways. I have. And did you ever hear voices? His eyes flicked up at that. Only once, he muttered. Heard Miss Eliza, plain as anything, crying soft near the hedge. But it weren't just her. There was another voice with hers. Low. A man's. I thought it might be Mr. Altham, but I weren't sure. Holmes nodded, thanked the man, and turned back toward the house. That confirms it, he said softly. Confirms what? I asked. That Eliza Marchwood was never alone. Not in life, and possibly not in death. The final piece of the day's inquiry emerged in Eliza's bedroom, where Holmes had returned alone while I spoke briefly with Sir Reginald in the library. When I rejoined him, he was standing at the small writing desk, holding between gloved fingers a delicate, withered bloom. A pressed viola, he said, folded between the pages of a prayer book. I peered closer. A love token? More than likely, it bears a faint scent still, carried often, perhaps hidden. He closed the book carefully and opened the drawer beneath, where I saw a set of aged documents, among them a half-folded paper with elaborate script. What is that? An unsigned draft of an addendum to the will, Holmes said. It appears Miss Marchwood had been promised a larger portion of the estate than previously known, conditional upon her marriage. To whom? Therein lies the missing signature, Holmes replied, and Sir Reginald conveniently forgets such revisions exist. As we departed the room, Holmes glanced once more at the empty chair by the window. Too many shadows linger here, Watson, and not all of them are cast by grief. And with that, we descended the stairs once more, the mystery tightening its grip with each silent step. The following morning found us in the village of Marston Hollow, a sparse hamlet nestled beneath the hills that cradled Grimston Hall. Holmes, ever the tireless seeker of context, suggested that the minds furthest from the estate might, paradoxically, hold its sharpest insights. Our first encounter was with the proprietor of a small tobacconist's shop, a woman with a sharp tongue and sharper memory. When Holmes made casual inquiry into the Marchwoods, her expression altered visibly. Strange folk, those, always kept themselves apart. But the girl, Eliza, she was different. Soft-spoken, yes, but not aloof. I saw her often enough on the lane to the woods. Alone? Holmes asked. Not always, she replied. Sometimes with a young man, dark-haired, wore no coat, even in chill weather. Wouldn't look you in the eye. Not one of their kind. This line was echoed at the village green, where an elderly man tending to hedges offered his recollection of Miss Marchwood and her poet, who met by the old standing stone near the forest's edge. A secret lover, I suggested as we departed. Holmes nodded. Likely so. The concealment suggests difference, in class, in status, or in motive. The Marchwoods would never have permitted a match beneath them, but the girl may have chosen otherwise. And if she did, she would need secrecy, and secrecy breeds opportunity for coercion, manipulation, or worse. We paused at the crest of the hill to look back at the manor. A fine mist clung to its rooftops. She trusted someone with her secret, Watson, Holmes said, his tone grim. The question is whether they ever intended to keep it. Holmes, ever one to blend folklore with logic when the two proved mutually illuminating, insisted we visit the local inn before returning to the hall. The Marchwood Arms, a weathered structure with low beams and the scent of peat smoke in the air, offered little in the way of comfort, but much, as it happened, in the way of story. The innkeeper, a man named Pike with a lazy eye and a fondness for his own voice, was only too eager to oblige. "You've come about the girl, haven't you?" he said, wiping his hands on a bar towel that had seen better days. "I'll wager you've heard the tale by now." "Enlighten us," Holmes said, taking no drink but leaning forward slightly. "Well then, centuries back, a Marchwood daughter fell for a stable boy. Family found out. Shamed, they locked her in the West Tower, same wing where the girls' room is now. Never let her out. Some say she died there, others say she escaped and cursed the bloodline. And they say she still walks?" I asked, not without skepticism. "Every generation or so, someone claims to see her. Pale face at the window, hair long and black. Always the same room. Always after a scandal." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "A legend built to suit the guilty conscience." "You don't believe in such things?" Pike asked. Holmes stood. "I believe legends endure where lies are left unchecked." As we stepped back into the late afternoon mist, I could not help but glance at the distant windows of Grimston Hall. "Do you think the villagers truly believe it?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Then softly, "Only those with something to fear believe ghosts come uninvited." Our return journey to the hall was taken not by carriage, but on foot along the wooded trail that passed beneath the estate's western slope. The path was narrow and silent, bordered by tangled underbrush and the faintest whisper of wind through bare branches. The sun had begun to slip behind the hills, and the forest, ever eager to reclaim the daylight, was already drawing its cloak of dusk about us. Holmes walked ahead, hands clasped behind his back, his eyes occasionally drifting to the path's margins. I followed in silence, my thoughts unsettled by the tale of the Marchwood ghost and the suggestion of a suitor who had vanished as surely as Eliza herself. It was Holmes who first stopped, Step lightly, Watson, he said, crouching suddenly. Do you see? I leaned down. A footprint. 2, in fact. Deep enough to be recent and not made by either of us. The spacing was narrow, the heel pressed sharply, the angle turned slightly outward. Not a servant's shoe, Holmes said, nor a workman's. They've been following us, I murmured. Yes, he replied, or perhaps leading us. We moved on with greater caution, but saw no figure, no movement. Yet I felt the weight of unseen eyes, and more than once I turned sharply, convinced we were not alone. When we reached the hall once more, Holmes paused at the entrance. This path is used, he said. Used in secret and often. Whoever left those prints knows more than they've said, I finished. Holmes did not smile. Or knows less than they ought, and is trying to learn more. That evening, Holmes requested access once more to Eliza's chamber, and to Sir Reginald's credit, or perhaps fatigue, no objection was raised. We ascended in near silence, and as before, the key turned with an almost ceremonial finality. The air within was colder than I remembered. Holmes moved immediately to the far wall, where the bed stood neatly against faded wallpaper. He tapped gently along the skirting board, then up along the plaster panels. I was about to ask his intention when he withdrew a penknife and pressed its tip into a narrow seam between 2 moulding strips. There came a faint click. The panel swung inward, not more than 2 feet wide, revealing a black opening behind the wall. Holmes lit a candle and ducked through without hesitation. I followed, though less confidently. The space beyond was a narrow passage, barely enough for a man to move sideways, running parallel behind the west wing. The floor was dust-covered but not undisturbed. Faint scuff marks showed where feet had passed. There was a thin draught, carrying with it the scent of cold stone and something else. A trace of candle wax? Oil? It was impossible to say. Holmes moved like a spectre himself, fingers trailing the walls. We passed behind what I surmised to be 2 adjoining chambers before reaching a second panel, identical to the first. Holmes examined it but did not open it. Another room, he said quietly. Unmarked on the plan, no doubt long forgotten. He turned to me. This passage was used recently, and not merely for escape. For entry, I whispered. Precisely. The locked room was never a prison. It was a stage. He extinguished the candle and replaced the panel. Come, Watson, he said. The house has spoken, but not yet confessed. As we returned to our shared quarters in the East Wing, Holmes fell into that peculiar state of preoccupation which often signalled the gestation of an idea. He seated himself by the writing table, withdrew a sheaf of notes, and began scanning them with a furrowed brow. Watson, he said at length, recall Dr. Mallory's phrasing. She was peaceful, pale, no doubt of death. Yes, I remember it. And yet we know no post-mortem was conducted. The body was viewed only briefly. No confirmation by a coroner. He paused, fingers tapping rhythmically upon the desk. The body, Watson, was never publicly seen. The funeral was closed, the coffin sealed. You suspect... I suspect the possibility, he interrupted, that no death occurred at all. Or rather, that the body declared dead was not in fact so. Mallory's language was too rehearsed, the timeline too convenient, and most damning, the window bolt, recently opened. A chill passed through me at the implication. Eliza Marchwood may never have died, Holmes concluded. Or if she did, it was not by her own hand, nor on the date stated. But why go to such lengths? That, my friend, is what we are here to uncover. But I would wager that what began as concealment has grown into something altogether more sinister. He stood then, and his voice was suddenly brisk. We must look to motive, and motive always walks in tandem with inheritance. That evening, I took a solitary walk through the hall's long gallery, hoping to quiet the disquiet stirred by Holmes's theory. I found myself reflecting not on the spectral figure in the locked room, but on those still living, those who stood to gain by Eliza's disappearance. When I returned, Holmes was reviewing the Marchwood family records, several bound ledgers spread across the library table. He greeted me without looking up. "You spoke with Altham again this afternoon, did you not?" he asked. "I did. He seemed unsettled. More so than before." Holmes nodded. "I've observed the same. His visits to the house have grown more frequent since Eliza's passing. He claims friendship." "Friendship," Holmes repeated. "And yet his name appears here." He tapped the open ledger. "As one of 3 secondary heirs named in Sir Reginald's estate, should Eliza be proven unfit or deceased." Good heavens. Indeed. And with Eliza presumed dead and no other direct heir, he moves to the forefront. "But surely Sir Reginald is not blind," Holmes replied, "but perhaps complicit, or perhaps afraid." He stood, drawing a finger along the spine of one of the ledgers. "The financial position of the Marchwood estate is not as secure as its facade implies. A marriage to a stable hand would have jeopardized Eliza's eligibility as heir. Better a quiet scandal than a public ruin." He turned to me. "If Altham knew of the liaison, he may have seen opportunity. And if Sir Reginald feared exposure, he may have agreed to arrangements. And Eliza," Holmes's expression darkened, "is no longer merely a victim. She is the axis around which every lie now turns." The drawing-room fire had long gone cold when Holmes summoned Mrs. Rudge once more. She arrived with some reluctance, wringing her apron and glancing nervously at the unlit grate. "You've kept this room closed since Miss Eliza's passing?" Holmes asked. She nodded. "Sir Reginald said it was to remain unused." "And yet," Holmes continued gently, "there is evidence of a fire lit no more than 10 days ago. The ash bears traces of wool and silk, women's garments if I'm not mistaken." Her lips pressed into a firm line. "I saw smoke one morning," she admitted, "from under the door. I opened it and found the fire smouldering. There were clothes in it, half burned. I didn't know whose." "Did you tell Sir Reginald?" She hesitated. Number I thought better not to ask questions. "I've served this family a long time, Mr. Holmes." He inclined his head, not unkindly. "You did what you believed best." When she had gone, Holmes turned to me. "They were trying to erase someone, Watson. Clothing, letters, any trace that might lead to doubt. But fire is not as thorough a servant as people believe." He stirred the ashes once more. "Even secrets leave embers." The final thread, as Holmes called it, came to light through a telegram sent from London the next morning. He opened it in my presence with a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. "From Lestrade," he said, "requested a quiet inquiry into Dr. Mallory's financial dealings." And 3 weeks before Eliza's supposed death, he was deeply in arrears. Debts to 2 banks, 1 chemist, and a private lender. And now, settled, Holmes said. Paid in full the week after the certificate was signed. A bribe? Or a gratuity? Call it what you will. He paced the length of the room. Mallory had motive, he had access, and he had debts. Always a dangerous companion to discretion. Sir Reginald required a certificate. Mallory provided one. But if Eliza still lives, then Mallory certified a falsehood. Perhaps he never examined her at all. Holmes turned to the window and stared into the fog beyond. This is no longer the case of a vanished girl or a family's shame. It is a structure of lies, layered, coordinated, and designed to protect the guilty at the cost of the innocent. He let the telegram fall to the table. The next move, Watson, must be ours, but it must be made carefully, for the house itself is beginning to watch us. The next morning dawned grey and hushed, the clouds hanging over Grimston with an oppressive stillness that seemed to reflect the weight of the lies we had uncovered. Holmes, rising early and without comment, composed a brief but pointed telegram. I watched him write it in silence, though I recognised the careful intent behind each word. "To Scotland Yard?" I inquired. "In part," he replied, "but the audience is not Lestrade." He handed the folded message to the footman with precise instructions for immediate delivery and return. When we were alone once more, I pressed him. "You intend for it to be intercepted?" "Precisely. A whisper can provoke far more panic than a declaration, particularly if the whisper suggests that Eliza Marchwood's grave has been disturbed." "But there's no grave to disturb." Holmes smiled faintly. "The truth, Watson, is the least of it. What matters is the impression." By late afternoon, the reply arrived. Holmes barely glanced at it before setting it aside. "It will reach the ears it must," he said, "and when it does, then the ghost of Eliza Marchwood will be seen one final time, though not, I suspect, at her window." There was a pause, during which I felt the strange pressure of anticipation settle around us like the thickening mist outside. Holmes rose and stretched his long limbs. "Tonight, Watson," he said quietly, "we shall wait in the dark for one who prefers to move within it." And so the trap was laid, not with rope or weapon, but with rumour and silence, the deadliest tools in Holmes's vast arsenal. The plan, if it could be called that, was deceptively simple. Holmes arranged for Sir Reginald to host an evening gathering in the drawing room, ensuring the household remained occupied and the upper floor seemingly deserted. Meanwhile, Holmes and I, armed only with patience and a single shaded lantern, slipped quietly into Eliza's room just before dusk. The chamber was unchanged. The same dust, the same scent of lavender and age, and that peculiar stillness which never failed to stir unease in me. Holmes positioned himself beside the bed, half shrouded in shadow, while I crouched behind the wardrobe, a revolver at the ready, though I prayed I would have no cause to use it. The hours crept forward with maddening slowness. Outside, the wind stirred faintly, rattling a shutter. Once, I thought I heard footsteps in the corridor, but Holmes merely raised a finger, warning silence. Midnight passed. The candle in Holmes's lantern guttered low. Then, sometime near the third hour, Holmes stiffened. A faint click, barely audible, broke the silence. The panel behind the bed began to shift inward. We watched, breath halted, as a hand emerged from the darkness, followed by the outline of a man, cloaked and cautious. He moved toward the desk with practiced stealth, unaware that two pairs of eyes followed his every movement. Holmes's fingers twitched, signalling restraint. I nodded, heart pounding. The intruder's hand reached for the drawer. It was time. Holmes stood slowly, his voice firm and low. "I wouldn't advise it, Mr. Altham. The dead, you see, are notoriously poor correspondents." The man froze, and the spell of the sealed room was finally broken. For an instant, the man said nothing. Then slowly, he turned, his face illuminated by the soft glow of Holmes's lantern. It was, as Holmes had predicted, Hugh Altham. But this was not the composed gentleman we had encountered in daylight. His hair was dishevelled, his collar open, and his expression one of startled desperation. "You," he began, then faltered. "Indeed," Holmes said coolly. "And you, I suspect, have been here before." Altham's eyes flicked to the panel behind him. Holmes shook his head. "The passage is closed. I imagine you've grown quite familiar with it these past weeks." Still, Altham said nothing. His gaze moved to the desk, then to the floor, as if calculating his next move. "Do sit down," Holmes added. "You've no doubt come to retrieve something." Altham remained standing. "Letters," Holmes continued. "Perhaps a journal, something that might compromise you or others." "You don't understand," Altham said at last. "None of you understand." Holmes arched an eyebrow. "Then I suggest you begin explaining." I stepped forward, revolver still lowered, but visible. Altham's shoulders slumped. "She's alive," he muttered. "Of course she is, but I couldn't let her speak, not after what she knew, not after what she might have said." "What she might still say," Holmes corrected. "Unless, of course, you prefer to let a locked room speak in your stead." Altham sank into the chair. "She was never supposed to be seen," he whispered. "But she was," Holmes replied, "and now she must be heard." The confession that followed was not delivered with the force of remorse, but with the weary calculation of a man who knew the noose had already begun to tighten. "She wrote to him," Altham said, staring down at the desk. "The stable hand. A dozen letters hidden beneath the lining of that drawer. I found them weeks after her supposed death." "You feared they would contradict the suicide," Holmes prompted. "Number worse. They confirmed she had planned to run away, that she was pregnant." I felt a chill pass through me. "Sir Reginald could not allow it," Altham continued. "He claimed it would ruin the family, said he'd take care of it, quietly. And then one day she was gone. No funeral, no body, just a locked door and a certificate." "And you?" Holmes asked. "I thought she was dead until I saw her, one night, at the window." "And you said nothing?" Altham's jaw tightened. "I said nothing because I realized then what I could gain. If she remained hidden, presumed dead, I stood to inherit. But if she returned, if she spoke, everything would be lost. So I came back. I burned what I could, hid what remained." Holmes nodded, almost to himself. A conspiracy born of silence, sustained by shadows. At that moment, a knock came at the door. Sir Reginald stood there, pale and trembling, but not with fear. Behind him, supported by Mrs. Rudge, was Eliza Marchwood herself, alive, worn, but alive. "Holmes," I whispered, "you were right." He did not answer. His gaze was fixed not on Eliza, but on the man who had tried to silence her. She was scarcely more than a shadow when I first saw her. Frail, drawn. Her frame swaddled in a heavy shawl, as if the chill of the months she had spent hidden still clung to her skin. Eliza Marchwood stood in the threshold like an apparition, born not of superstition, but of long-repressed truth. Sir Reginald followed behind her, his expression not one of relief nor guilt, but exhaustion. A man who had borne the weight of a secret for so long that its unveiling came as a strange kind of mercy. "Eliza," I breathed. She looked past me to Holmes. "You knew," she whispered. Holmes bowed his head slightly. "I suspected. The details were merely waiting for their rightful witness." Sir Reginald stepped forward, but she recoiled. Holmes raised a hand, not unkindly, but firmly. "Miss Marchwood," he said gently, "you have nothing further to fear. Mr. Altham has made his position perfectly clear. What remains now is your voice." She hesitated, then nodded faintly, her eyes meeting those of the man who had sought to erase her. "I was never dead," she said softly, "only buried, alive in silence." Altham said nothing. There was nothing left for him to say. Sir Reginald, for his part, leaned heavily against the doorframe. "I never wished for this," he muttered. Holmes turned toward him, his voice suddenly sharp. "No, Sir Reginald. You wished for it to go away, and so it did, into the walls of your house." The hallway fell quiet, save for the creak of the floor beneath Eliza's trembling step. The ghost of Grimsden Hall had returned, not to haunt the living, but to reclaim her name. The room was silent, but for the crackling of the hearth. Sir Reginald, seated now, stared into the flames with the fixed gaze of a man watching the final embers of something once grand. Holmes remained standing, his silhouette tall and unforgiving beside the mantel. "It was never meant to happen that way," the baronet said at last. "She told me. The child, the stable hand. I forbade it. She refused. There was an argument, and then silence. I found her weeping the next morning." "You presumed her broken," Holmes interjected coldly. "I presumed her lost," Reginald said, "but still of my blood. I could not endure the shame. So I arranged it. Her death? No," he said quickly. "A retreat, seclusion. I gave instructions that she should be kept in the old servants' quarters, attended, discreetly. No one was to speak of it." "And yet you forged the appearance of a suicide," I said. Reginald bowed his head. "It was necessary, to quiet the house, the papers, the villagers." Holmes folded his arms. "You buried her to protect your reputation, and in doing so, gave others cause to bury her more thoroughly still." "She was safe," he said, though the words lacked force. "Safe from whom?" Holmes asked. "From shame? From life?" Eliza stood at the doorway still, silent. But this time, it was not fear that stilled her. It was resolve. Sir Reginald turned to her, but she said nothing. The truth had been spoken, and there was nothing more he could offer in its place. With Altham detained and Sir Reginald disgraced, the final piece of the puzzle was placed, not by force, but by the clarity of Holmes's deductions. We returned to Baker Street the following morning, the chill of Sussex still clinging to our coats. Holmes, as ever, resumed his customary pose by the fire. I, meanwhile, could not resist remarking on the case. "You suspected Altham from the beginning?" "Not from the beginning," Holmes replied, "but from the moment he faltered at Eliza's name. Guilt is a poor actor, Watson. It always forgets its lines." "And the inheritance?" "Once I confirmed his standing in the will, the rest followed logically. A false death, a complicit doctor, a secret pregnancy, and a man who used every shred of it to press advantage." He reached for his pipe. "His error, of course, was returning to the room. Greed rarely knows when to quit." I nodded, then asked, "And Eliza?" Holmes paused. "She will not haunt that house again, Watson, nor will it haunt her." There was a moment of quiet. "And Reginald?" Holmes exhaled slowly. "He buried the truth beneath the stone of reputation, and in doing so, built a mausoleum from which no honour can emerge." In the days that followed, Holmes, as was his custom, offered the full outline of his deductions with the calm clarity of a man describing the conclusion of a chemical formula rather than the unravelling of a family's most guarded shame. I recorded his words carefully, though I confess that even as I wrote, I marvelled anew at the intricacy of the case. "The first and most dangerous falsehood," Holmes began, "was not Eliza's death, but the assumption that her reappearance must imply the supernatural. That illusion protected the truth far more effectively than locked doors or forged certificates." He turned to me. "You recall, Watson, the legend of the Marchwood ghost. A face in a window, a girl imprisoned for love. The details were too precise to ignore. But the legend was not inspiration for the crime. It was its shield. Thus, I said, Eliza's appearances were never accidental." "Correct. She was seen because someone allowed her to be seen, or perhaps wished her to be. Whether it was Altham's carelessness or Eliza's own longing, I cannot say. But it broke the illusion and gave us the first thread." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "The rest followed logically. A sealed room that was not sealed. A death no one verified. A man enriched by silence. A girl erased by convenience. What seemed a haunting was, in fact, a calculated fraud, masked in the guise of family tragedy. I said nothing. The ghost was dispelled, yes, but the chill of its passing had not yet left me. Holmes reached for his pipe. "Grief," he said, "requires mourning. But guilt, it requires misdirection." As Holmes began to recount each clue in its place, I was reminded once more of how swiftly chaos may be reordered by the hand of logic. What had appeared to the untrained eye as an impossible mystery was, in fact, a puzzle assembled by lies and fear, and one that, once past, revealed its pieces plainly enough. "The footprints in the garden path," Holmes began, "were the first indication that the west wing was not as lifeless as claimed. They did not belong to any servant, nor to Sir Reginald, and they appeared on evenings only, precisely when Eliza was said to be seen." He turned slightly in his chair. "Then there were the dust patterns. A dressing table left untouched for weeks, yet bearing a single finger's path. The bedclothes uncreased, save for two subtle impressions. The bolt on the window, rusted, yes, but scraped clean along the edge. All signs of recent occupancy, and not, I might add, by a ghost." "Indeed," I interjected, "but why the secrecy? Why not simply remove her altogether?" "Because removal implies responsibility," Holmes replied. "Hiding her was preferable to explaining her. Sir Reginald wished for her disappearance to seem tragic but final. A scandal averted by silence." He continued. "The servant's passage confirmed the physical possibility. The house, as with many of its kind, was built with hidden corridors, meant once for quiet service, later forgotten, but still functional. From that route, anyone could enter Eliza's room without unlocking a door or disturbing dust on the threshold." "And the figure seen at the window?" I asked. "A result of habit or hope," Holmes said. "Either Eliza herself or someone allowing her the briefest glimpses of sky." He looked at me then, quietly. "Even a prisoner, Watson, dreams of windows." Holmes's tone grew colder as he turned to the most practical and perhaps most disturbing details of the deception. The logistics of confinement and the paperwork that sustained the lie. "Eliza was never entirely alone," he said. "Though hidden, she was not neglected. Meals were brought to her, likely by Mrs. Rudge or another servant instructed under threat or bribe. She was kept in a manner not unlike convalescence, confined to a single wing, told she must not be seen. Whether she understood the full extent of the deception is unclear." "Surely she must have suspected," I murmured. "She did," Holmes replied. "But when one is isolated, one's doubts are often silenced by fear, and she had something more to fear than disgrace." He gestured to a folded certificate upon the table. Dr. Mallory's signature gave the death legal weight. No coroner was called. The family, citing grief and tradition, closed the casket. A burial was staged with stone and cloth alone. Mallory was in debt and shortly thereafter inexplicably solvent. And the letters Altham sought? Written by Eliza during her early days of confinement. Notes to her lost lover, preserved beneath the drawer lining of her desk. They spoke of hope, confusion, and fear. He added more softly, "Altham discovered them later, and with them discovered opportunity." I felt the heaviness settle in the room again. "To silence a living girl," I said quietly, "and make her a ghost." Holmes nodded once. "Not every prison has bars, Watson. Some are made of reputations, and others of secrets kept too well." I must confess that when Holmes first suggested there was more at stake than mere inheritance, I failed to grasp his meaning. But the final truth, delivered not in speculation, but in the quiet fact of a child, stilled even my well-worn pen. "During her confinement," Holmes explained, "Eliza bore a child. That fact above all was the one her family could not risk becoming known. The arrangement had been delicately handled. A governess, one formerly in the employ of the Marchwoods, had been paid discreetly to care for the infant in a cottage not a mile from the estate. Records of the woman's departure existed, but not of her return, and it was only through Holmes's inquiries that the full picture emerged. Eliza was told her child had been taken away, he continued, for the child's safety, but it was leverage, a method of compliance. To speak, to escape, was to risk never seeing her child again. I recall the moment we stood with Holmes near the cottage garden, where the boy, no older than 2, played with a wooden hoop beneath the watchful eye of the governess. Eliza stood beside us, unmoving. Holmes did not speak. He merely gestured gently. Eliza crossed the threshold, as if in a trance. When the child turned and ran to her, her knees gave way, but she did not fall. She caught him in her arms, and her silence was broken only by the softest weeping I have ever heard. Back in Baker Street, Holmes sat in stillness for a time before lighting his pipe. "A ghost is easily imagined, Watson," he said, "but a child, that is a truth that cannot be buried." And in that quiet corner of Sussex, the Marchwood line was not ended in disgrace, but reclaimed in the only way that mattered. The law, as it so often does, moved slowly in the countryside, but where the machinery faltered, Holmes ensured momentum. Within 48 hours of our departure from Grimsden Hall, warrants were dispatched from Scotland Yard with sufficient discretion to avoid unwanted scandal, yet with enough force to leave no ambiguity regarding their intent. Sir Reginald Marchwood, though not arrested, was summoned to London for formal inquiry into the concealment and false reporting of a living heir. He arrived pale and diminished, a shadow of the man who had first stepped into Baker Street pleading for discretion. His fortune, though intact, was quietly placed in trust pending further review. The baronetcy remained his. Title clings to lineage more tenaciously than honour, but his reputation, long the pride of Sussex society, was irrevocably lost. Hugh Altham, in contrast, was not granted the dignity of quiet disgrace. He was arrested on charges of coercion, conspiracy, and attempted fraud. It was Holmes who provided the letters, the forged documents, and the financial trail, all precise, all damning. I was present when Altham was taken into custody. He did not protest. Indeed, his silence spoke more eloquently than any plea could have. And Dr. Mallory, the final actor in this sorry drama, proved the most elusive. He fled upon hearing word of Altham's arrest, but was intercepted en route to Dover, his medical case brimming with false identification and foreign currency. He was returned under escort, his fate sealed by the very papers he had once signed so freely. Holmes offered no triumph in their undoing. He merely observed as we watched the final carriage depart. Justice, like illness, spreads slowly, but when it arrives, it rarely spares the physician. It was nearly a week later that Holmes and I found ourselves once more before the familiar hearth at Baker Street, the memory of Grimsden Hall still heavy upon us. Outside, the London fog rolled thick against the window panes, but inside the fire crackled, casting long shadows across the carpet. Holmes was silent for a time, his gaze fixed upon the curling smoke from his pipe. I, meanwhile, could not help but reflect aloud. "It is a curious thing," I said, "how the most disturbing crimes are not committed in alleyways or opium dens, but within drawing rooms hung with portraits and lined with heirlooms." Holmes gave a faint smile. "The opium den does not fear exposure. It has no facade to protect. But a family name, that is a far more delicate thing." I nodded slowly. It was not hatred that drove Sir Reginald, nor greed that moved Altham. Not entirely, at least. It was fear, of ruin, of whispers, of social death. "Precisely," Holmes replied, "and such fear, when left to fester, produces acts of astonishing cruelty. A girl imprisoned, a child hidden, a physician bribed, and a household steeped in a lie so deep it nearly became truth. There was a pause. "I wonder," I said, "what becomes of her now?" "Eliza." Holmes tapped the ash from his pipe. "She will not return to Grimston, nor will the child. They have been given means to begin elsewhere, under another name, far from stone corridors and shuttered windows." I glanced toward the fire. "And yet the house remains." "Yes," Holmes said, "and in its silence it will remember. Brick and timber forget nothing, Watson. They are the final witnesses." He stood at last, drawing his coat from the chair and placing his pipe upon the mantel. "You see, Watson," he said softly, "ghosts seldom haunt the living, but the living, alas, are too often haunted by their own misdeeds." And with that, he turned toward the window, where the fog pressed like memory against the glass. I made no reply. There was nothing to add, for in that single sentence, Holmes had given not only the resolution of a case, but the epitaph of every locked room where silence had been mistaken for peace. And the fire crackled on, its light fading into thought. As the fire dwindled and the hour grew late, I found myself once more pondering the strange fate of the Marchwood legacy. Holmes, as ever, seemed immune to sentiment. Yet as he leaned back in his chair, pipe forgotten in his hand, I saw something in his gaze, not pity, but recognition. "You see, Watson," he murmured, "truth does not decay in silence. It waits. It waits behind doors we pretend are locked and windows we claim are empty. And when it returns, it does so not as vengeance, but as consequence. And so I wonder, in a house where every secret had a keeper, what do you think was the true turning point? Was it the forged death, or the choice to believe it? Tell us what you think in the comments. And if you enjoyed unraveling this mystery, do subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes cases like this one, and share the story with someone who loves a good twist in the dark. The game, as ever, is far from over.